Hello and good evening. Thank you all for joining for our Structuring Sentences for Success workshop. My name is Professor Hannah Khan, and I serve in the Ally Center as a student support specialist. And then I also serve at LBC as an adjunct professor. And so I teach writing courses, public speaking, literature. I'm just really passionate about English and the English language and writing and art. And so I'm just so thankful for those gifts. And tonight we are going to talk about some grammar and syntax and how we effectively structure our sentences so that we are communicating our ideas well, grammatically correctly. And I am really excited. So let's open up with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, God, I thank you for this opportunity to gather together tonight and talk about language and how you've just given us the gift of communication, Lord. I just pray for each and every student who's here, each and every student who's later watching this recording, Lord. I just pray that you would guide and direct their steps as they seek to honor and worship you in their studies. And I just pray, Lord, that our conversation tonight would be edifying to you. And we love you and thank you, Lord. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
So to begin, I just want to go through a brief agenda of what we'll be covering tonight. So we will have an introduction and icebreaker activity, and then we are going to focus on 4 different types of sentence structures. And so when it comes to setting up sentences, there are kind of 4 main types with how we arrange our clauses. And so we're going to review those. And then we're also going to talk about some common comma myths and mistakes because along with grammar, we want to talk about punctuation. And so we want both our grammar and our punctuation to be used correctly. And how do we use commas well? So we're also going to be talking about that in the midst of our workshop. And then really throughout, I want this to be very much a time of community and communication. And so if at any point you have a question, feel free to raise your hand, jump in, because if you have the question, more likely than not, someone else also has that question. So I'd love to hear from you throughout the workshop. We'll do a few activities together and workshop some sentences to just make sure that we're all on the same page with understanding. And then if you're able to, I understand some people are at work or eating dinner, but if you're able to, I'd love for you to have your cameras on so that we can just really spend this time together. That would be awesome. If you can't have your cameras on, I totally understand. Yeah, we will jump right in. All right, so for our icebreaker activity, we're going to look at an incorrect sentence, and we're going to try to identify what is incorrect about it. So if someone writes, "I finished my paper, I submitted it late," what feels wrong here, and how could we fix it? I finished my paper, I submitted it late. What kind of feels off about this example?
I guess it's the I submitted it,
Okay. Yeah.
or is it missing a comma between paper and I don't know.
So you're on the right track there. So what we have here are 2 independent clauses that are incorrectly, insufficiently joined together. So this is called like a fused or run-on sentence where we have too many independent clauses not properly joined together. So one way that we could fix it would be just by adding a period here after paper. We could just split it into 2 sentences. We could add a semicolon, which is another punctuation mark that we'll go over later tonight. And then another option is we could even add a comma and a coordinating conjunction. So we could add a coordinating conjunction such as and. So I finished my paper and I submitted it late. Or I finished my paper, yet I submitted it late.
That's
So we,
actually sounds better.
yes,
Yeah.
right, because right now it's like, oh, there's just too much going on and it's not quite right. So it's always good. Something that I really recommend students to do as they're going through and revising and editing papers is to read it out loud because sometimes when we're reading it and we hear it, we might be able to catch something that maybe our brain, just as we're reading through, we didn't catch when we're just reading in our heads. So I also recommend that. Okay, so today's goal in our workshop is to learn about kind of three tools that can help build and structure sentences. So clauses, which are sentence building blocks, conjunctions, which serve as connectors within sentences and even between clauses, and then commas, which kind of serve as like traffic signals for readers. So it indicates, pauses, it indicates, different types of clauses. And we're gonna work through that as we go through our workshop. So to begin, what even is a clause? A clause is a group of related words that contain a stated or implied subject and verb. Okay, so what does that really mean? If we break it down even farther, there are two primary types of clauses. There are other types, but for the purposes of this workshop, it's kind of helpful to just initially understand the two primary kind of umbrellas of clauses, which are independent clauses and dependent clauses. So, independent clauses, as the name suggests, means that they are independent. They can stand on their own as a complete sentence. For example, I like ice cream. She reads many stories. So we have our subject, our verb. Here we have an object. But really, what we're doing here is we're expressing a complete thought. This is an independent clause. It can stand on its own as a sentence because it has a subject, a verb, and it expresses a complete thought. Whereas dependent clauses still have a subject and a verb, but they do not express a complete thought. And one of the ways that we know that, or really the primary way that we know that, is they'll begin with a subordinating conjunction. Now, there's quite a lengthy list of subordinating conjunctions, but really whenever you encounter a dependent clause, you're going to find yourself asking questions because we want more information. So if we say, although I like ice cream, well, although I like ice cream, what? There needs to be an independent clause paired with the dependent clause for there to be a complete thought expressed. So here we have the dependent clause, although I like ice cream. To make this stand on its own as a sentence, we could add an independent clause, I prefer frozen yogurt. So I prefer frozen yogurt is an independent clause. It expresses a complete thought and it stands on its own. And the dependent clause can lean up against it to form a complete thought and be a sentence. So although I like ice cream, I prefer frozen yogurt. That could then collectively be a complete sentence. Similarly, with the second example, because she reads many stories, well, because she reads many stories, what? We're wanting more information. It doesn't express a complete thought as is because it is a dependent clause. So, because she reads many stories, she is knowledgeable. Well, she is knowledgeable is an independent clause. It expresses a complete thought, subject, verb, expresses a complete thought. And it's strong enough for this dependent clause to lean up against and collectively then be a sentence together. Any initial questions about clauses, independent versus dependent clauses? As we go throughout the
No.
workshop, we'll continue building on these ideas. Okay, all right, thanks. So a little bit more about how to understand clauses. As a reminder, an independent clause expresses a complete thought and it can stand on its own as a sentence. And the independent clause includes a stated or implied subject and verb, and it expresses a complete thought, such as another example, the student finished her essay. So we have the subject, the verb, and then again, here it can have objects as well. So we have an object. The student finished her essay. Now, again, just a reminder, as dependent clauses, it's an incomplete thought that needs help. It needs additional support to be grammatically correct in a sentence. So, for example, because the student was tired. Well, because the student was tired, what? Because the student was tired, she finished the essay slowly. So when we add an independent clause here, it's bolded and underlined. Together, because the student was tired, she finished the essay slowly. We understand the relationship between those two clauses, that due to her being tired, she finished the essay slowly. Oh, that makes sense. There's a relationship between those two ideas established by the subordinating conjunction because. So that was a quick little review of what we talked about so far. So, independent clause can stand on its own as a sentence. Dependent clauses need additional support. So let's take a minute to apply our learning and talk through and identify whether a clause is independent or dependent. So to begin, although the class was difficult, is this an independent clause or a dependent clause? What do we think?
I would say dependent.
Dependent. Very good. Yes. Yep. It can't stand on its own as a sentence. It's begging really to add more information. Very good. Yep. Although is another subordinating conjunction. The professor explained the assignment. Independent or dependent?
Would it be independent?
Correct. Yes. Very good. Very good. So it's an independent clause because we have that subject, the verb, it expresses a complete thought. Very good. Our third example, when the research was finished.
Dependent.
Dependent. Very good. Yep. We need more information. The students revised their papers.
Independent.
Very
Independent.
good. Independent. Very good. All right. Excellent job. Okay, so moving from clauses into sentence structures, the first type of sentence we're going to talk about is the simple sentence, which is really just one independent clause. It's typically the first type of sentence we learn, very straightforward. It contains a subject and a verb. It may also include an object or modifiers. It expresses a complete thought. For example, he reads, she listens to an audiobook, they shared a meal. So we've already covered a lot of simple sentences tonight, but they're kind of the entry level sentence. Not to say that they're simple than the other sentences, but they are still very effective. So don't let the name fool you. They're still very effective for college writing and academic writing. Um, we want to be clear and concise, and simple sentences can very much accomplish that. Now, a compound sentence is where things get a little bit more interesting. Welcome, Marvina. Thanks for joining. Compound
Good
sentences.
evening. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. All right. So compound sentences consist of two or more independent clauses joined together by either a semicolon. So that's that punctuation mark we talked about earlier. So a semicolon or a comma and a coordinating conjunction. Now, something I love about the coordinating conjunctions is that there is a relatively short list of coordinating conjunctions, and you can remember and memorize them with the acronym FANBOYS. So here are the coordinating conjunctions: for, and, nor, but, or, yet, so. Fanboys. So I'd strongly recommend that you memorize this list. It will serve you well as you go throughout your time writing in college and beyond. So when we are creating compound sentences, we have two or more independent clauses, and we'll look at a few examples. So I went to the park and Courtney joined me. So here we have two independent clauses. I went to the park, Courtney joined me, and we are connecting them with a comma and a coordinating conjunction. So each of these clauses could stand on their own as simple sentences, but because we're forming a compound sentence, we are merging them or joining them together. Another example, Joe wants to make chili tonight, but he doesn't have the ingredients. So here again, we have two independent clauses, and we're joining them together with a comma and a coordinating conjunction. Now here we have the fish swam away, semicolon, the shark followed. So anytime we're using a semicolon to join together a compound sentence, we want to make sure that the clauses are related. Really, just like any of these two clauses, we don't want to just pair up two random unrelated independent clauses that really wouldn't make much grammatical sense to pair them together in one sentence. And so here we have the fish swam away, the shark followed. It's very clear from the context of the sentence that the shark is following the fish. And then the family went to the beach for vacation, so they packed beach towels. So here we have compound sentences. So from here, we're going to look at a non-exhaustive list of subordinating conjunctions. So we just talked about coordinating conjunctions with compound sentences, and now we're switching gears to talking about subordinating conjunctions. I don't know why the terms have to be so long. Every time I teach and talk about this, I'm always like coordinating, subordinating. So I didn't make the terms, but I'm here to teach them. But when it comes to subordinating conjunctions, these are going to begin dependent clauses, which of course we talked about just a few minutes ago. So I'm not asking you to memorize this list. I personally don't have this list memorized, but it is helpful to review and familiarize yourself with not only the specific subordinating conjunctions, but also the categories that they kind of fall under. So then as you go about reading and writing, you can more readily recognize relative adjectives, cause and effect, place, concession, condition, relative pronouns, time, comparison. So when you see the word after, after he ate lunch, well, after he ate lunch, what? After he ate lunch, he took a nap. We can begin to recognize, that's a subordinating conjunction. That begins a dependent clause. Therefore, we need at least one independent clause to support that dependent clause grammatically. So putting this into action, we have our next type of sentence, which is known as the complex sentence. Complex sentences consist of one independent clause and one or more dependent clauses. So here we are, we looked at a few complex sentences earlier, but here are a few more examples. While it snowed, Tracy watched a movie, although she should have been doing her homework. So this sentence has three clauses in it. Can we identify the first clause and whether it's independent or dependent? So what's the first clause in this sentence?
Is it Tracy watched a movie, although it's like kind of seems like a run-on.
So it kind of feels like a run-on sentence. Thank you. So it initially kind of feels like a run-on sentence, but that's because we actually have an independent clause sandwiched between two dependent clauses.
What
So
that would be the although.
that's actually all. So although she should have been doing her homework is the second dependent clause, whereas the first dependent clause is while it snowed. So
Okay.
while it snowed couldn't stand on its own as a sentence.
Okay.
And although she should have been doing her homework, couldn't stand on its own as a sentence. Whereas Tracy watched a movie is our independent clause that is supporting both of the dependent clauses on either side.
Okay, got it.
Yes, yes. So here we're beginning and ending with dependent clauses, and then in between we have our independent clause. So while it snowed, dependent. Tracy watched a movie, independent. Although she should have been doing her homework, dependent. So that was a little bit of a tricky one. Oop, sorry about that. And then our second example, the students who played soccer left class early. Now, this one is also a little bit of a tricky example because actually our dependent clause interrupts our primary independent clause. So, who played soccer is our dependent clause. It further explains who the students are, but really our main independent clause here is the students left class early. But we might be asking ourselves, which students? The students who played soccer. So in the dependent clause here, who is functioning as the subject, played is our verb, and then soccer is the object. But we have then our main independent clause, the students, subject, left, subject, or excuse me, verb, class early. So this one's a little bit more tricky because we have the dependent clause in the middle, in the midst of the independent clause. And then we have the famous words from the hymn, because he lives, I can face tomorrow. So here we begin with a dependent clause, because he lives. Because of that, I can face tomorrow, which is our independent clause. So this slide, we looked at a few trickier examples. What questions do you have about complex sentences? As the name suggests, they are kind of complex. And something else I'd like to point out while we're on this slide is the purpose of these exercises and breaking down these different types of sentences is, of course, it's helpful to be aware of, oh, that's a simple sentence, that's a compound sentence, that's a complex sentence. But really, this is just to equip you with different types of sentences to use in your writing to help you vary up your sentence structure. So when we're writing, we want to use different types of sentences throughout. We don't want to use all simple sentences. We don't want to use all complex sentences. We want there to be a nice mix so that there is a nice rhythm and style to our writing, because it's also the way we talk. We don't only speak in simple sentences. I did this. We went here. Like it would feel a little bit robotic. Likewise, it would feel a little bit complex if every sentence we spoke was a complex sentence. If we were always saying while and although and because, like it would kind of snowball into just a lot going on. And so as we go through, it can feel a little bit overwhelming of, wow, there's so many different clauses and types of sentences, but really the heart behind this is to strengthen your writing and strengthen the toolbox from which you write so that you're just that much more equipped and prepared to write and convey the ideas that you want to in your writing. So I hope that's helpful.
It was.
There's good, good, awesome. Yeah, it can feel I remember just feeling so overwhelmed in my advanced grammar class during my undergraduate degree because it just felt like chemistry for language. Like I was just like it was so complex and it can be really easy. It can be easy to feel overwhelmed. But at the end of the day, this is really just tools in our toolbox. And so it's helpful to know the terms and the terminology, but it's that much more helpful to be able to put it in action and actually apply what it is we're learning. So helpful caveat there. And then the fourth type of sentence that we're talking about this evening is the compound complex sentence. And now this is kind of taking everything that we've talked about so far and putting it into one type of sentence. So in compound complex sentences, we have two or more independent clauses and one or more dependent clauses. So it's compound because it has at least two independent clauses, and it's complex because there's at least one dependent clause. So our examples. While the students were taking the exam, the power went out. So the professor had to improvise. So looking at our first clause here, while the students were taking the exam, is that
That's a
independent or
complete sentence. Yeah, that's independent.
okay, what makes you say independent?
Right, that's what you said, independent or dependent?
Oh yes, yeah, I was asking the question.
Oh no, while the students were taking the exam, no, that would be independent. It's not complete,
So it's
right?
not complete, therefore it's dependent.
Right, dependent, right. Sorry.
Yes. Yep. Oh no, you're good. You got it. You got it. Yes. So while the students were taking the exam does not express a complete thought, and therefore it is a dependent clause. Another clue that can help us there is it begins with while, which is a subordinating conjunction. So we know here that this is going to be a dependent clause.
Okay.
Thanks, Asia. All right. On to that next clause. The power went out. What type of clause are we looking at there?
That would be independent, I believe.
Independent. Excellent. Yes. So we have our subject, the power, went, verb, out. Well, went out is kind of a phrasal verb. So it's expressing a complete thought. The power went out. So the professor had to improvise. What's that last type of clause there?
Dependent.
Okay, so it's a little tricky because we have so, which is actually one of our coordinating conjunctions. So actually, sometimes it can be helpful to take out, because this is one of our fanboys words, that kind of clues us into, oh, this is actually an independent clause.
Okay.
So
Okay.
yes, that this one is really tricky. If we take away the so, which is one of the fanboys, the professor had to improvise could stand on its own as a sentence and it expresses a complete thought. And here it's just helpful to remember the fanboys because that's where it gets really tricky with, okay, what's a subordinating conjunction and what's a coordinating conjunction? And that's why I really recommend and encourage students to memorize the fanboys list because that clues you into, oh, so is the S in fanboys, therefore I'm working with another independent clause here. So that is our first example. Now let's break down this next example. Although Patricia prefers going to the lake, she chose to visit her family at the beach, and they were so excited to see her. All right, to begin, although Patricia prefers going to the lake, what kind of clause are we looking at there?
Is that dependent?
Dependent.
Yes, yep, you got it.
Okay.
You both got it. Great. Although Patricia prefers going to the lake, well, it begs for more information. It doesn't express a complete thought, and it begins with a subordinating conjunction. All right, on to the next one. She chose to visit her family at the beach.
I would say independent.
Yeah, you got it. You got it. We have our subject, our verb, and it expresses a complete thought. Very good. And then our last clause here, and they were so excited to see her. The and makes it a little tricky, but if we remember what type of conjunction is and, is that coordinating or subordinating?
coordinating, I would say. Isn't it similar to the so?
Yes, yeah, you got it. And then Diana, it looked like you were saying something. You're on mute at the moment.
Yeah, I said the same thing, coordinating.
Excellent. Awesome. Awesome. Yes. So because that's part of the fanboys, it's a coordinating conjunction, which then clues us into this being a independent clause.
Dependent. Mhm.
All right. Excellent. Thank you all. Yeah, so that was our particularly technical part of the workshop. So hopefully from here we'll still be talking about commas and grammar, but that was kind of the really technical part of the workshop. So thank you all for being such great sports working through that. I know it can just be a lot to kind of work through grammar, so I appreciate all your efforts. And then here we have this final table chart that I just find to be really helpful as just a visual to clue us into, all right, what type of sentence has has what type of clauses? And we can just remember simple sentences, one dependent clause. It's only ever going to have one independent clause, which is very nice. Compound sentences have two or more independent clauses. There will be no dependent clauses. So two or more independent. Complex, one independent and one or more dependent. Compound complex, at least two, if not more independent, and then one or more dependent. And again, you don't necessarily need to memorize exactly the simple compound, the different types of sentence structures. It's just really helpful to be familiar with the conventions and then how to use the different types of conjunctions to pair clauses together effectively. All right. So I know I just said we don't need to memorize this, but let's just kind of do a little a little check-in here. Sorry, I probably should have saved that spiel until after we did this activity. Um, first example, she ran to the store before it closed. Simple, compound, or complex.
Um, I would think simple.
Very good, Marvina. Yes. So this one, it is a simple sentence. It can feel a little bit tricky because there's two different prepositional phrases to the store before it closed, but at the end of the day, there's only one independent clause. She ran really is actually ultimately all you need for this sentence, but then we have the modifier of to the store before it closed, which are two prepositional phrases. Very good. All right. We went to the park and we played soccer.
Is that compound?
Compound, excellent. Yes, we have our two independent clauses joined together by a comma and then a coordinating conjunction. Excellent. Because he studied diligently, he passed the test. I didn't mean to bold the word diligently there. That just happened. What type of sentence are we working with there?
Is that also compound?
So we're working with two different clauses, but it's not actually a compound sentence. That's a good guess. But here we actually have an independent clause and a dependent clause. So that would then make it what type of sentence?
Would it be complex?
Yes, you got it. Because he studied diligently is our dependent clause. He passed the test, independent. Together, it's a complex sentence. Very good. And then finally, I enjoy playing the piano.
I have a random question. I'm sorry. I
Yes,
was
yeah.
always, I remember being told to never start a sentence with because. Is that
Yes.
not true? Or okay, that is true.
Well, no. So there are some English teachers who will teach to never begin a sentence with because, simply because a lot of times when you begin with because, people will just include, not you, sorry, when students are writing, they might just say because he studied diligently, period. Well, that's a
Incomplete.
exactly. So a
Yes.
lot of times in like elementary school or middle school, we might be taught stay away from beginning sentences with because sometimes students won't then include the independent clause that's required to form the complete thought.
Okay.
And then in
Mhm.
some sentences, or excuse me, in some circumstances, people will sometimes think it's a bit informal, but largely a lot of times in um, higher level writing, it's an accepted convention.
Okay. Thank you for letting me know.
Yes, yeah, excellent question. Excellent question. Yeah, I'm glad you brought it up because yeah, that is usually a hesitation because many of us were taught growing up like stay away from starting a sentence with because. But as long as you have an independent clause to support the dependent clause, then you have a complete sentence.
Okay.
All right, very good. Okay, and then just that last sentence here. I
That
enjoyed
would be
playing.
simple.
Simple. You got it. Very good. Yep. I enjoyed playing the piano. All right. Great work. Okay, so now we are going to work on combining two simple sentences in some way. So whether we make it compound, whether we add a subordinating conjunction and make it complex, we could add a comma and a coordinating conjunction. I'm actually going to go out of presentation mode to go into editing mode. So for this first example, I was hungry, I made a sandwich. How could we join those two together in a grammatically correct way?
I was hungry, so I made a sandwich.
Very
And
good.
so I made a sandwich.
Yeah, so the first one, yeah, so as long as we have a comma, so is the S in fanboys, and so we can join those two and make a compound sentence. Very good. All right, the baby woke up, the dog barked.
I would say because the dog barked.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, so there we're adding a subordinating conjunction. Oh, and something that is helpful to note is when a sentence begins with the dependent clause, we'll place a comma after the dependent clause. So because he studied diligently, comma, he passed the test. However, when the dependent clause is placed after the independent clause, like in this sentence, the baby woke up, because the dog barked, we actually won't have a comma there. That's a really common grammar misconception. All right, third example. It started to rain. He forgot his umbrella. Diana, you're on mute.
It started to rain, but he forgot his umbrella?
Excellent. Yeah, that's a great way to join those. It started to rain, but he forgot his umbrella. And then finally, she didn't go to school. She was feeling sick.
Would it be because she was feeling sick?
Yeah, that would definitely be one way to join those two. Very good, because she was feeling sick. Great work. Okay. Okay, so now we have talked a lot about clauses and sentence structures, and now we are going to switch gears and talk a little bit more about commas. So we're going to dispel a few common comma myths. So these are things that people often believe about commas, but aren't actually true. So many people believe that long sentences automatically need a comma. But this actually is not true. A really long sentence may be perfectly correct without commas. The length of a sentence does not determine whether you need a comma. So depending on the arrangement of clauses, you may or may not need a comma.
I didn't know that. That's good to know.
Yes. Yep. Common comma myth number 2, you should add a comma wherever you pause. So I think sometimes students in elementary school are taught this of like, oh, wherever you pause to breathe when you're reading a sentence, that's where you need a comma. And unfortunately, that's just not always true because people pause and breathe at different points in the sentence, and it doesn't reliably indicate where a comma belongs. So we shouldn't just put one wherever we pause. Another common comma myth is commas are so mysterious that it's impossible to figure out where they belong. Some rules are a little bit flexible, but most of the time, commas belong in very predictable places. And we're going to actually talk about some of the places that they belong up next. So here are some common places that we put commas. This whole workshop is such a tongue twister. I just feel like all of the words that I'm saying are so similar or just different by a very slight difference. So we can use commas in a series. So here we have a list of 3 individuals, Emily, Maggie, and Tim. Here we put commas after the first 2 people in the list, or if we were listing like grocery items or something like that, we could also use those commas there. This is actually one of those areas where comma usage is up for debate. Some people are very adamant about placing this comma here after the second item in the list. This is called actually the Oxford comma, whereas others are actually very adamantly opposed to the Oxford comma. So you will see sometimes where 3 items are listed in a list, and there may or may not be a comma between the second and third item, or actually, if it's more than 3 items, it's just before the last item. So if there were 4 items in this list, it would be after the third item. So that's a little bit of a controversial grammar topic. I personally like the Oxford comma, so I opt and prefer to include the Oxford comma when I list items in a series. So this example sentence, Emily, Maggie, and Tim started a Bible study that meets on Wednesdays. We also use commas for introductory phrases or transitions. Each week, comma, they discuss a certain passage, then, comma, they end the meeting with a hymn sing. So when we have some introductory information, usually a phrase or a word, we will use a comma after that. We will also use commas with appositives. So what's an appositive? That is a word or phrase that identifies, renames, or describes a noun or pronoun. So in this sentence, Nathan, a biblical studies major, leads the study. Now here we are further describing who Nathan is, and in this case, it also even establishes some of his credibility of why he's the one leading the Bible study. We also will use commas with non-restrictive clauses. A non-restrictive clause is not essential to a sentence's meaning, but it does add additional detail. So the club, which has been meeting for about a month, is growing in size. So here, this is another one of those kind of tricky examples where the dependent clause is interrupting the larger independent clause, or not the larger, but just the overarching, the independent clause. So here we have, which has been meeting for about a month. It's a dependent clause, begins with a subordinating conjunction. And then the main independent clause in this sentence is the club is growing in size. But we place commas around this non-restrictive clause because we could technically take that out and the sentence would be perfectly fine as is. This just adds additional information that's helpful for the reader to know. So we've talked about some comma myths, comma uses, and of course, comma uses in addition to what we talked about earlier with commas and coordinating conjunctions to join independent clauses. So this was a non-exhaustive list of comma uses, but just some really common ways to use commas. Okay, so now we're going to go into some comma mistakes. And one of the main comma mistakes is known as a comma splice. What is a comma splice, you might ask? It's a grammatical error in which a comma separates two independent clauses. And as we know from our discussion throughout this workshop, a comma on its own is not strong enough to join two independent clauses. It needs a coordinating conjunction as well. So this is an incorrect example. It's a comma splice. So it is not grammatically correct, but this is what a comma splice would look like. I'm counting the days until summer. It's not getting any closer. So here we have two independent clauses that are incorrectly joined together with just a comma. So we're going to look at several different ways that we could remedy and fix this issue. And some of these are going to look familiar. Actually, all of these should look, except for one of them. Most of these will look familiar based on what we talked about earlier in the workshop. So in order to fix a comma splice, we can use a comma and a coordinating conjunction. I'm counting the days until summer, but it's not getting any closer. So here we're using one of our fanboys coordinating conjunctions and a comma to join independent clauses together. So a comma and a coordinating conjunction. We can also use a semicolon. So that's a really nice piece of punctuation to join together two independent clauses. It also, I just think, I just always feel very sophisticated in my writing whenever I use a semicolon. It just kind of elevates it. We can also use a semicolon and a conjunctive adverb. So we haven't talked about conjunctive adverbs yet, but however, therefore, moreover, these are ways of connecting ideas, connecting clauses, but they're not strong enough to just join together the clause with a comma. So you need the semicolon, and then you can add in the conjunctive adverb to further establish the relationship between the two clauses. So I'm counting the days until summer, semicolon, however, it's not getting any closer. So semicolon, conjunctive adverb, and a comma. I love a good however in a paper. I actually find myself using however a bit too much. We can also make the two clauses independent sentences. I'm counting the days until summer, period. It's not getting any closer. So we can just split them entirely into two simple sentences. Sometimes the simple option is the best option. So we can always do that if that serves our writing well in that moment. We can also add a subordinating conjunction to make one of the clauses dependent on the other. So if we add a subordinating conjunction, because I'm counting the days until summer, it's not getting any closer. So this is a bit of an exaggeration because no matter what, time is going to move on at the same rate that it's always moved on. Days consist of 24 hours, but it can often feel like when we're really focusing on the calendar, because I'm counting the days, it's not getting any closer. It doesn't feel like it's getting any closer. Okay, a few more grammar kind of helpful things to think about when we are looking at our papers and our writing examples. We want to check our papers for any disruptive commas between subjects and verbs. Sometimes when our subjects or like the beginning of our sentence is a little bit longer, sometimes we just like feel the need to like throw in a comma. But as we talked about earlier, just because it feels like we need a comma doesn't necessarily mean we actually do. So we want to make sure that we find the subject and verb in our sentence and that we haven't separated the subject from the verb with a comma. So we wouldn't want to say, this is an incorrect example, the train coming down the track, comma, is going to be late. That is incorrect. Whereas the train coming down the track is going to be late. So we don't want to just throw commas in random places. We don't want to separate the subject and the verb. Now, if we had like in a positive or a non-restrictive clause, like we talked about earlier, then we might have a pair of commas separating our subject from our verb, but we don't want just like one random comma separating our subject and our verb. We also want to check for disruptive commas between compound verbs or objects. So as we're revising and editing our papers, we want to look for the 7 coordinating conjunctions this isn't in fanboys order, but and, nor, but, so, for, or yet. Feels so strange to read them out of order. Not that there is an official order, but for the acronym there is. We want to check to see if there's an independent clause, a complete sentence, on both sides of the conjunction. If so, we'll place a comma before the conjunction. If not, we don't want to place a comma before the conjunction. This is a really common error that people make because and but can serve multiple purposes in a sentence. And so here we can join, or here here, but is not joining 2 independent clauses. So they bought 2 pizzas, but ate only one. We don't need a comma here because there's no subject in the second part of the sentence. Now, if we said, but they ate only one, then we would add the comma. But because there's no subject, we don't actually need the comma there. So we just want to keep our eyes out for any incorrect comma placement. So as we talked about at the beginning of our workshop, clauses are sentence building blocks, conjunctions connect ideas, and commas help readers understand sentence structure. Okay. Thanks for letting me know, Asia. Whenever you need to jump off, feel free to. So thanks so much for letting me know.
Thank you.
Yes. Okay. And just as we close out, so we can just remember the 2 clause test as we're going through our writing assignments. When we're editing our paper, we want to ask, does this sentence contain 2 complete thoughts? And this D shouldn't be capitalized, my apologies. If yes, you need one of these, a period or a comma and a coordinating conjunction or a semicolon. So for example, the research was complicated, comma, so the students needed help. We're joining 2 independent clauses together with a comma and a coordinating conjunction. We could just as easily place a period here or a semicolon, but we need to make sure that we're pairing independent clauses together properly or separating them with a period. So, for additional grammar support, you are always available to schedule a one-on-one appointment with the Ally Center. So myself and my lovely, wonderful colleagues are always available to support you in your writing journeys. And then we also have a library guide that provides additional resources on grammar and the writing process as well. So that is a wealth of resources, and it can be found actually through the library or through the workshop page, and I can send that link if anyone is interested. So that was all of the content that we had for tonight. thank you so much for joining. I really appreciate your enthusiasm, your willingness to participate. I know grammar is not always the most exciting subject, so I appreciate your willingness to be here, to work through these topics. And yeah, thank you so much. God bless. And if does anyone have any questions? I'll just open the floor.
Yes, I do.
Yeah,
Thank you so very much.
yeah, thank
Excuse
you.
my lateness running in.
Yeah, no problem.
Um, will you send this out or is this on
Oh,
YouTube
yes.
or? Okay,
Yes, so I will, once Zoom processes the recording, I will upload it to our Ally Center YouTube page, and I can send you the link to view that as well.
okay, yep, because this was very, very helpful. It was good.
Awesome.
Thank you so much.
Awesome. Yes, you are so welcome. All right, any other questions, comments? Okay, all right. Well, again, thank you so much for joining. Once the recording is ready, I will be sure to send it out for your uh, viewing. And if there's anything else that I can do, feel free to reach out.
Thank you.
Thank
Blessings,
you all.
everyone.
Blessings.
Thank you.
Thank you.